could possibly give me a recap on how it was that you ended up in prison as an innocent single parent, please.
Yes. So one night my council meeting was cancelled, and so myself and a councillor from the Green Party, we decided that we'd go down to a local art display place in the city and meet up with some friends there. And we decided we had a beer, and it turns out that she was on some medication that didn't agree with it, so I had to bring her back in a taxi. And so I took her back to hers in a taxi, at which point she was quite rowdy. And when I took her indoors, unfortunately, the taxi driver thought that I was her.
Uh-huh.
And so he then rang up and reported the behaviour in the taxi, but gave a description of her. I went home. Next thing I knew, there was a knock on my door, and I had, I think it was 6 police officers, only 1 woman, 5 men. Could have been 7, but I think it was 6. And they knocked on the door, and then they actually pushed their way in. And they said, We're come to arrest you. We understand that you've been out drinking, were behaving in a strange way in a taxi, and then drove home in the taxi. And so I said, well, actually, you can't arrest me for that because I've got a child in the house. You'll have to wait till somebody turns up. So I sat down, I didn't struggle or anything. And they said, no, we're taking you away. And I said, well, you can't just cart me off until I've sorted out somebody. And I had a babysitter earlier who had a taxi waiting for her outside.
Mm-hmm.
So she was then going to the taxi. My 3-year-old was upstairs. They carted me off and left it like that, with me shouting and screaming, hang on, you can't take me away because of my child. They then dropped charges that they were going to bring against me 6 weeks later, told me that they'd got a description, it fitted my friend who'd been in the taxi. There was no evidence, nobody turned up. The taxi driver who'd reported in the first place didn't even bother to turn up, because he realised he'd described somebody else by then, when he saw a picture of me, obviously. And so 6 weeks, 7 weeks, I made a complaint and said that they came to my house and left my child and didn't find a safe place to send her, and I didn't know where she was and couldn't find her the next day. It turned out that she was actually at the house of the babysitter that had been there earlier, but the stepfather of the babysitter was there, who was on bail for attacking or ABH towards one of his children. So that's where they'd taken my daughter, and the police couldn't tell me where she was, and the next day I had to drive round with my friends from Suffolk in a car, freezing cold because it was a cold day, with no coat, jumper or anything, just as they released me from the police station, and try and find my daughter, who was then 3.
God.
So they came back 6-7 weeks later and said, I understand you want to make a complaint. And I asked who they were, and they said the Independent Police Complaints Committee. I do know who they were specifically. I asked them how long they'd been the Independent Police Complaints Committee, and they said 6 or 7 weeks. We worked for Norfolk Police as police officers with the people you're complaining about, basically.
No
I didn't
way.
say that, but they did. They told me that they'd worked there 6 or 7 weeks before in the police force, which they'd been retired out of to be the Independent Police Complaints Commission, in order to interview me about the way the police behaved.
Really?
Their friends, in other words. And so they said to me, are you sure you don't want to make a complaint, do you? You don't really want to make a complaint, do you? And I said, yes I do, but I don't want money, or I don't want any fuss. I just want something put into your papers or undertaken that in future, if you arrest any single parent or any person who's got responsibilities for caring for someone, you make sure the person who's cared for is with somebody who can look after them, somebody that preferably they know, before you cut somebody off who has primary care responsibilities. And they still said, you don't want to make a complaint, do you? And then friends advised me, said, oh, you should drop it, you shouldn't complain. And I said, well, I thought, no, I should complain because it's going to carry on. So I carried on with it. They went off. Then there was a knock at my door a week or 2 later. They came back, they said, right, we're charging you with attempting to pervert the course of justice by getting a false statement. And I just looked at them totally incredulous and said, you having a laugh? don't be ridiculous. And I thought, what on earth are you talking about? It holds up to an 11-year sentence for perjury.
Good God.
And I just looked at them and thought, this is ridiculous. And they said, well, the babysitter who was round here when we came and arrested, or just before we arrested you, has now given a statement and says that you asked her to write a statement saying the police treated you badly and so on. But I said, but they did. And so they said, well, we think that's perjury, so we're going to arrest you. And I'm like, don't be ridiculous. But in the course of all the arrest and everything, I had a barrister for the original charges, and he had interviewed this girl, and she had told him that they had pushed me over a sofa, treated me quite badly, carted me off, didn't tell me where my child was and so on. And she had made a statement over the telephone to my barrister. So they then took me to court, but in the meantime they kept coming around my house harassing me. They'd come around at odd hours of the day or night when they knew I was on my own. They brought in witnesses who...
So what started all of this? The trigger? Was it the other woman in the taxi, or was it your work at the council, or what do you think it might have been?
That actually had an executive role for the community and access disabilities, social things, and the one of the committees I sat on actually had a role which gave pretty much permission to the police to do certain things and not others, and helped make up what their role was in the area. So when they heard that somebody who had a responsibility on the police committee, representing the council on the police committee, had made a complaint about the police couldn't have that, so they did everything they could to block it. Even though it's a genuine complaint, it got to the press, at which point they went all out to stop me from making the complaint. If I'd have stopped the complaint, they wouldn't have made up the stats, but they did. So in order to then block the statement from my barrister, we went to court, and as soon as my barrister came in and gave the statement and told them what had happened and that was witnessed by the babysitter leaving and the statements he had and my witnesses, they arrested my barrister and told him he was under suspicion of perjury, at which point he'd had a career where he hadn't had any problem, and he was nearly 60, ready to retire. So he had no reason to do anything ridiculous at that point and actually ruin his whole career. And he was then under suspicion. He was then moved to the side of the court and had to call himself up a Queen's Counsel to represent him.
Good grief.
I then had to employ two new solicitors from King's Lynn who came in, and then they had to order a retrial. We had another retrial with a false start because something else that went wrong, so I ended up at a third trial almost having a breakdown in the meantime because I couldn't afford the childcare. I had to get different people to come with me and drive each day because I was shaking, and I sat and listened. I couldn't even give a witness statement by the end of it because I just couldn't speak because I was just hearing so much rubbish, it just didn't make any sense. And I had so many police then come round actually in a threatening manner, without being threatening, but that demeanour. Basically, we're going to arrest you and cart you off down the police station when we know you've got no childcare unless we come into your house and you answer questions about your lawyer who's been arrested. So they were then coming to question me as a witness in a case against my lawyer. That case was taken to court 2 years later and he was found not guilty, and it was all a load of rubbish. So nothing really happened.
So what happened to the police that had done that? Anything?
We went back to the court and I told the judge that they'd been round my house questioning me about a separate case in the proceedings when they also were in the proceedings against me, and that was a conflict of interest, and they were told not to do it anymore. But by that time they'd done it so much and I'd become sort of gibbering wreck. So
this is all just because you were trying to help communities?
Something like that, yeah, I guess so.
It says a lot, really, about human rights and Agenda 21 and the Charters of the United Nations, doesn't it, really?
I got carted off to two police officers' houses who were actually suspended and about to be sort of quietly asked to retire with a big handout from the police in Norfolk.
Really?
Yeah. And I'd never met them before, but I got taken to see one by a friend from the church who I just happened to meet this person, and they offered her 380,000, and another.
What was that for?
They were the people running the domestic violence unit, funny enough.
Really?
And they had found corruption within Norfolk Police, and so
Yes.
they had then basically found that their colleagues weren't willing to back them, i.e. not arresting people who'd committed crimes who were related to or were part of the police force, not going after certain criminals who were giving information and informing for the police, ignoring certain things that were going on related to drugs, money, so on. And these two people had wanted something done about it, and the police force said, no, it ruins what we're up to. And they'd been sort of shipped off sideways, and one person nearly had a breakdown, offered a lot of money. The other person I was taken around, he said, well, I'm sorry, they're out to get you, and that's what they do.
God.
I hadn't met him before.
Wow. Thanks, Sam. Is everything sorted now?
It is, after I ended up doing 2 months of a 4-month sentence in a high-security prison. Just for nothing, really? And then when I got my CRB back, it says I've never been cautioned, I've never been in prisons, I've never been questioned by the police, I don't have a criminal record. It just disappeared.
Funny that, isn't it? Yeah. Thank you very much. Thanks, Sam.